Hello, everybody, and welcome to You'll Have to Dumb This Down for Me. I'm Mikey,
And I'm Kevin.
and today we're going to talk about US elections.
Yeah, specifically US presidential elections, as it may come as a surprise to about two of you that there's one coming up this year.
No way.
Yes, November the 5th.
I haven't seen anything online about it at all.
No, it's really, it's for the the kind of the hardcore politic heads only. So we're going to talk about specifically the presidential election and specifically how it works. Now, as is the tradition on this podcast, we do have to nip something in the bud straight away. We're not going to be talking about politics on this, or predicting who will win, or advising you who to vote for, or anything like that. This is kind of purely about the mechanics of what will happen, what does happen, and what might happen. We will not be advising you on how to vote or which party we side with or anything like that.
No.
Agreed, because
We're a very neutral, this podcast.
Very neutral.
Most
very
extreme neutral podcast you could have.
Yeah.
Extremely medium.
Just absolutely, just straight down the middle. So, what do you know about the US presidential election, Mike?
I just think it's one of the most confusing things I've ever seen because there's something about swing states.
There is something about swing states. Oh, we'll get to swing states.
Yeah, we'll get to swing
You'll be
states.
sick of swing states by the end of
He'll be
this.
swinging.
Yeah.
And I don't know, would I be right in saying in the last election more people voted for the last one candidate? Like, there more actual physical people voted for the losing candidate.
Not in the last election, no, but that can happen, yeah. So, US presidential elections, they are not a straight vote where everyone just votes and whichever candidate gets the most votes wins. That's not how they work. They're done through something called the Electoral College. So when you cast your ballot for who you want to be president, the best way to think of it is what you're actually voting for is which candidate you want your state to vote for. Okay? So every state has a certain amount of votes and you're voting for which candidate you want your state to vote for.
Yeah.
Okay? So essentially there's 538 Electoral College votes, and if you get 270, you win the election.
I was going to say there's 50 votes.
No, there's not 50 votes.
Okay.
So yeah, we'll actually come on to that now. So there are 50 states, and Washington, D.C. also have Electoral College votes. So there's 51 jurisdictions voting.
Okay.
Which actually, it's not often talked about, spoken about in places like Guam, American Samoa, and particularly Puerto Rico, which are in America. They're American citizens. They don't have a vote.
What?
They don't have a vote in the presidency.
So who can they vote for?
They can't vote for either of them. They don't have a vote. So I think there's about 5 million people in Puerto Rico. So it's a fairly sizable.
That's insane.
Yeah, it's pretty mad.
I never knew that at all. Now so. Would that be like, say, someone in the Achill Islands?
Achill Island, yeah.
Achill in Achill Island.
Yeah.
Not being able to vote.
Kind of, yeah.
Presidents.
Yeah.
That's insane.
Yeah, our presidential election is done very differently. But yeah, it's it's more for kind of signing envelopes and stuff, our president, than, actual presidency stuff. But yeah, so these votes, the 538 votes, they're distributed across all the 50 states and Washington, D.C. They're sort of done per population. So what happens is each state starts with 3 votes, and then the rest are distributed per population. Small states, population-wise, like Wyoming, North Dakota, South Dakota, and Washington, D.C., for example, they would have 3 votes each, whereas enormous places like California has 54, Texas has 40, Florida has 30, etc.
So highly populated area.
Yeah, exactly. This does generally go with population, and, like you were saying earlier on, most of the time the person who gets the most votes wins the election. But what you might notice is, because everyone starts with 3 votes, if you're from a smaller state, your vote technically means more, or counts for more.
Yeah.
So if you're from South Dakota, your vote is actually worth more than, say, if you're from New York.
So that's why, if you're in a highly populated, how important it is for you to vote.
Well, it's important to people to vote.
Anyway, but it's almost more important, I would say.
Well, it's never, everyone should vote, but, it certainly does count more.
Yeah.
So, and then the key thing with all of this, in that in nearly every state, in 48 of the 50 states and in DC, it doesn't matter if you win the state by 1 vote, you take all the Electoral College votes. California has 54 votes. If you win California by one vote, you get all 54 electoral college votes.
Okay.
So, I mean, and that could, in theory, we'll get to an example of this in a while, but, you could win California by one vote, meaning that 10 to 15 million people have voted against you.
And you get that.
But you get all of their votes. So,
would you be fuming?
Like, the kind of poster boy for this, and the election that pretty much kind of shapes how modern elections are kind of run and spoken about in the US and how a lot of the terms have come from, is the 2000 presidential election between George W. Bush and Al Gore. So in this election, Bush actually lost the popular vote. Al Gore got more votes than Bush. But Bush won, and he won by winning Florida. And Bush won Florida by 539 votes.
Jesus.
So that's 0.009% of the vote in Florida.
He just got it. That's
the skin of the skin of the skin of your teeth.
My God.
There was over 100 million people cast their vote in that election all across America. And to have it come down to 537 votes is incredible. So that's why it's very important to target states. There's a YouTube channel, CGP Grey, he does a couple of excellent videos about the Electoral College, but he's worked out in one of them that you could actually win the US election with just 22% of the vote by winning a small minority or winning a small majority in the smaller states, if you get me. So very unlikely, but it can happen. So now, I mentioned... Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, isn't that just bonkers?
Crazy, yeah.
Like, absolutely bonkers. How was that ever decided?
Well, I wasn't going to go too much into that because you can get very much into the weeds in this, but this system has its origins in a time when America was being set up as a country, and we're getting from, say, Georgia to New York was a week-long journey on a horse.
Yeah.
So it was more important to have the local election and then
spread it out. Yeah.
So, but yeah, it's crazy that can happen. So now, we're going to look at how we can put all this into practice in November, but I'll just give a quick mention to there's two states that do it a little bit differently, namely Maine and Nebraska. So what these do is they divide themselves up into congressional districts. So they're essentially split, and they give a vote to whoever wins the district, and then they award 2 further votes to whoever wins the overall state. So it's highly likely that Maine and Nebraska won't allocate all their votes to one candidate, that they will at least take one to the other candidate. Again, it doesn't make a huge difference in the scheme of things, but it is different. I think it probably would be a better way of doing things if more states adopted that kind of system.
Yeah.
And another interesting point, again, before we go into actually November, is these electoral votes, they're actually people. So every state has, we'll say, I mentioned, Florida has, what was it? California has 54 votes. That's actually 54 people who California send to cast their vote on the election. They promise to vote whichever way California has voted.
My God.
But there is nothing legally binding them to voting that way.
So, for argument's sake, you could just pay those 54 people to vote for you.
You could. Now, that would be corruption. But you could do that, yeah. Or, for example, it very rarely happens because these people tend to be employed by the political parties themselves.
Okay. Right.
So if you win a state, with most US states, if they're sending, say, a Democrat, then they're going to have House of Representative Democrats, they're going to have Democrat senators. A lot of the apparatus of the state will be Democrat anyway.
Okay, so you kind of know what way you're going to vote.
Now, this has happened, that they've gone and voted for someone else. Now, it's never swung an election, but it does happen and it can happen, and there's no legal obligation on them to do it. They're called fateless electors.
Wow.
Yeah.
So you lose all your credibility. Like, I'm assuming it's a public vote. Like, you would know what way they voted for you.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Okay, well,
they'll see who's voted. So that's kind of the theory. Now, we're not going to get too into the weeds about where the electors and all, because we could be here all day. So how does this translate practically into a US election? So depending on where you start your count from, it's at least 150 years since the US elected a president that didn't come from either the Democrat or Republican Party. It's actually 1968 since anyone even won an electoral college vote that wasn't from those two parties.
My God.
Now, there has been, as I said, a couple of stray kind of fateless elector votes since then. But since anyone won one on merit, it's since 1968. It's essentially a two-horse race.
Yeah.
There was a guy called Ross Perot who won nearly 20 million votes in 1992, and he actually split the Republicans and Democrats in a few states, but he didn't win any states.
Okay.
He's the last one to really put a dent in the two-party system.
So they don't have parties like us, like we would have Labour, Green, Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael, Sinn Féin.
They have small versions, like there are Green parties, but it's very hard to get on the ticket in a state unless you're a Republican or a Democrat. They have so much money and so much. Again, I don't want to stray into politics here, but they have so much.
They're just two superpowers, really.
Yeah, two superpowers. The point being essentially is that unless something incredibly crazy happens, we are looking at a Republican or a Democrat president for the foreseeable future. So it's two-horse race. Two candidates vying for 50 states plus DC to get elected, right?
Yeah.
Wrong.
God.
So in reality, there aren't 50 states at play here at all. There are about 7.
Right.
Okay. So this is where these are often referred to as purple states, or as you said earlier, swing states. In the vast majority of US states, in recent times, they've been divided into red or blue states. Red being Republican and blue being Democrat.
Yeah.
Now, it's a very recent phenomenon. It really only started getting traction in the 90s, and again, like the 2000 election, when it was actually coined as a phrase. Certain states vote a certain way. So since 2000, 35 states have voted the exact same way on every single election.
Okay.
So if you look at the two biggest states, we'll use these as examples, California and Texas. Biggest population-wise, obviously. Alaskans, don't come at me. California is extremely unlikely to vote for a Republican, and Texas is incredibly unlikely to vote for a Democrat.
Yeah.
So Texas is red, California is blue.
Yeah.
Okay. And that is the case in the vast majority of US states. Even Florida, which was the one that became so close in 2000, it is still now solidly expected to be a red state in the upcoming election. Now, there's recent polling. Again, I don't want to go into that, but most people would predict that to be a red state.
Yeah.
So what this means for November, and assuming that all the blues and reds hold and they don't flip, and remember both sides are looking for 270, you would put Harris, the Democrats, at 226 and Trump at 219.
Wow.
So slight advantage to Harris, but there's 7 states that will remain in play. Arizona and Nevada out west, Wisconsin and Michigan in the north, Georgia and North Carolina kind of in the south, and the one we're going to just do a little bit of a focus on, the big battleground, 19 electoral college votes, Pennsylvania.
I feel like it's always just been Florida for me. Florida
traditionally has been because it's so big and it was a swing state. For most of this century, if you lost Florida, you were kind of behind the 8 ball. You really needed to win all the other swing states.
Okay.
Now, there's a chance the Democrats could flip Florida, but we're not going to go into the politics of it.
We're not going to get into it.
We're just going to take it that's going to be red for the purposes of continuing the video in any sort of meaningful way.
So Pennsylvania.
It's not absolutely crucial, right? But if you keep the 7 states out of it, there's roughly 20 combinations each of states that you can get together to win the election for each candidate. But if you lose Pennsylvania, that goes down to 10 combinations for Harris and only 6 for Trump. So 20 combinations down to 6.
Right.
Trump would need, or indeed Harris, needs a lot else to go right if they lose Pennsylvania. Like, it's not exactly Florida in 2000. Florida's a much bigger state. But this election that it's highly likely 160, 170 million people will vote in could come down to a few votes in Pennsylvania.
Jesus.
And like that's why, for example, in US elections, if you look for the word coal miner, you'll hear that a lot. And it's not because either of them, America is absolutely full of coal miners. Pennsylvania is.
So it's their vote you want.
It's their vote you want, So just listen out for that. Pennsylvania is a really, really key state and all this.
Isn't that mad to think that politics boils down to someone you would never think of in politics, like a coal miner? Like,
yeah. Now, a coal miner is just an example. It could be a steelworker, it could be anybody. But this election of a country that most people would consider bigger than a continent could well boil down to a local issue in Pennsylvania.
Crazy.
You know? Like it did in Florida at the time. So now, lastly, and I suppose, this is something that maybe keen-eared listeners will have spotted. 538 is the total amount of votes. That is an even number, which means
it can be split.
It can be a draw. And if you take, I didn't work this out now, there's a very helpful site called 270 to Win, which did this for me. If you even leave it with the 7 swing states in play, there are 3 combinations that are not entirely unlikely that could lead to a 269 draw.
And what would happen then?
So what happens then? I'm glad you asked. I'm very glad you asked.
That wasn't scripted.
You'd think it would be. So they don't share the presidency like it's some sort of children's toy or, the Prime Minister of Ireland role. It's a political joke there. In this instance, what happens is the House of Representatives would break the tie. But they break it. There's 438 members of the House of Representatives, and they all vote as blocks within their state. So it will come down to who has probably got one of the most states. Now, in general, that probably would mean that a 269 tie would result in a Republican win. Republicans, in general, tend to win a lot of the smaller states, more rural states, whereas Democrats tend to win the bigger, more urban states. And actually, because there's 50 states, that can also be a draw as well.
Oh, God.
And there is quite a Dublin versus Meath 1991 here. I won't get into it, but there is a lot of... It's never happened, but it can actually happen.
Imagine it happened just after this podcast.
Yeah, imagine, yeah.
Find DB Cooper, and there's a massive draw.
Yeah, we'd have, God, we could retire. But yeah, so that's what happens in the event of a tie. As I say, it's never happened. It has happened once before, whereby in way back when there wasn't a 2-party state, that there was a couple of candidates and none of them got an overall majority. So it can be used for that instance as well. But that's not going to be relevant to this election. I would imagine every single electoral college vote will go to either the Republican or the Democrat. Okay, is that clear?
That is, it's a lot clearer than I would have imagined before, all right, but it's also a big mess.
It is a big mess, and it does lead to, as I said, 5 times in the US's history, somebody who didn't win the popular vote has won the presidency.
I think that's just bonkers. Like, I know that's how they work it, and that's the old way. Is it not outdated?
Quite possibly, yeah, quite possibly. I mean, in this modern way with people voting online or voting postal votes, it does seem a relic of an older system. It's a 1700s solution to a 2000s problem.
Yeah.
But who are we to tell the Americans how to run their elections?
2 random Irish guys sitting in a box room in Meath.
Yeah. So that's pretty much it. All we'd say is to any Americans who are listening, get out and vote, because
absolutely
your vote makes a difference. Even if you're from a state that you think is a solid red state or blue state and you want to vote the other way, you never know, you might be able to flip it. And I suppose, most importantly, and not to be too soppy about it, but there's a hell of a lot of people in the world who would love to be able to go down to a ballot box and peacefully have a say in who runs their country.
Yeah.
So not to take it for granted. And
there's even people in your own country that can't vote.
Exactly. So just get down there and do it for them.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Listen, thank you so much for listening. I've been Kevin.
I've been Mikey.
Thank you very much.